The Cultural Revolution of 1966 was to be the great counterpart to the political revolution of 1927, and the Red Guards were to be, essentially, the new Chinese Red Army. The Red Guards would destroy the artifacts just as the Red Army fought the capitalists. This destruction reformed Chinese traditions, revolutionized Chinese culture, and ignited the reaction of the masses.
The Cultural Revolution was born upon the basis of Mao's theory of continuous revolution. This theory argued that reactionary forces were permanent, and to combat these forces, there would need to be a consistent, positive effort to maintain the socialist ideas and culture. Most importantly for the Cultural Revolution was, as John Starr describes it, the process of revolution or struggle must be forced upon the cultural superstructure, those institutions which function to instill or alter the values held by individual members of that society. To carry out this continuous revolution, Mao created the Red Guards, a group of young masses that in theory would be able to effectively dispel the ultra-reactionary bourgeoisie rightists and counter-revolutionary revisionists. And to do this, they worked to control the cultural superstructure, which led to the destruction of cultural artifacts, changing of cultural pieces, and the dissolvement of the Red Guards themselves, as the Chinese masses did not approve of this takeover. One of the main shifts in thought during the Cultural Revolution was from the idea that socialism would eventually replace religion and that it would no longer be needed, to a belief that religion would need to be actively weeded out. This meant that the Red Guards would go after religious authorities and holy places. This led to many Buddhist temples being destroyed or repurposed and citizens facing severe persecution that forced them to drastically alter how they worshipped. In fact, a Japanese monk traveling through China noted that some temples were converted into apartments. He said that temples that were previously thriving were now barren and used only for the Red Guards. The destruction and closure of these sacred sites not only disrupted the spiritual lives of hundreds of thousands of people in China, but it also led to the displacement and forced labor of resident monks. In a sweeping effort to force China into secularization, these monks were violently pressured to break their sacred vows. Many cultures in Tibet were destroyed, which had a horrible human cost. In his autobiography, the monk, Palden Gyatso, recollects about how the Red Guards used violence to take away the religious life for people in Tibet. He describes one particularly symbolic event. Jompa was the abbot of the Shangpatak monastery and the great learned monk of Gandan. No amount of beating or torture had been sufficient to make Jompa submit and trounce his religious vows, but no one could have predicted the way he reacted to the announcement of his death sentence. Jompa wailed for mercy. He prostrated himself before the Chinese officer, as monks used to do before their teacher or a high lama. Alongside this forced secularization, the threat of execution was routinely used to terrorize monks into abandoning their faith. There is no doubt that centuries of ancient Buddhist traditions were permanently lost, as religious figures were either violently coerced into giving up their spiritual lives or left to die in prison. Ultimately, this brutal suppression of religion reveals exactly how violently traditional Chinese traditions were restructured during the Cultural Revolution.
To further our inquiry into the subject, we asked Kong Fangping, a third grader during the Cultural Revolution, about his experiences.
Did you know any artifacts, temples, or historical sites that were affected by the Cultural Revolution or the Red Guards?
文化大革命其中一个重要的目的就是破四旧，就是把以前旧的这种历史上的很多东西都要把它砸碎毁掉。我在长春市就是亲眼看过在一个寺庙里面，红卫兵把那些经卷呐都在院子里面把它烧掉。很多寺庙里的那些僧人、老道什么，他们都给红卫兵下跪，希望他们能手下留情。但是红卫兵根本不搭理他们，该烧还烧，几乎全国到处都是这样，把那个很多古代建的那些文物啊什么的都给砸掉、烧掉，尤其是山东的孔府，把孔府都给砸掉了。
Especially in the
Before the Cultural Revolution, Mao wanted a serious redirection of Chinese culture. He complained that China's artistic accomplishments were too few, despite considerable efforts. So, he put the promotion of socialist art in the hands of his wife, the former actress Jiang Qing. For her, the Cultural Revolution was an opportunity to provide new political direction for the arts. She saw art as playing a leading role in the transformation of man and society. During the Cultural Revolution, Chinese art was changed through Western influences that Jiang Qing introduced and took the opportunity to later protect when the Red Guards dissolved. She presented her set of 8 model theater plays to the nation in 1967. One of her more notorious works is Madmen of the Modern Age, staged in Tianjin. It was about Chen Lining, who was put into a mental hospital before the Cultural Revolution for critical notebooks on the writing of Liu Shaoqi. When Liu fell from power, Chen was freed, but later, his notes critical of Mao were discovered, so he was declared a counter-revolutionary by Jiang Qing. Jiang Qing took advantage of the end of the Red Guard movement to halt its extreme cultural naivetism. She intervened to protect 2 important art forms that the Red Guards labeled as bourgeoisie: oil painting and piano music. Although Jiang Qing was happy to see individual artists suffer because of her immense jealousy for any competition, she was not willing to allow unsophisticated Red Guards to deprive her of her oil paintings and Western music. Twin 1968 campaigns hailed an oil painting of Chairman Mao Anran and the piano version of a model opera, The Red Lantern. As a result of Jiang Qing protecting these art forms, the oil painting of young Mao on his way to a minor strike was put up all over the nation, 900 million copies in total. Though actual imported Western paintings and music were controversial throughout the Cultural Revolution, no one would question adapting their basic methods and materials, now purified for the revolution. This changed Chinese culture as Western elements were let into some of the most important cultural pieces.
Before the Red Guard was fully dissolved, Michael Oxenberg noted in his The Cultural Revolution 1967 in review that, in the West, there was too much focus on the whims of Mao when analyzing reasoning behind government actions. He notes that other factors were still important. The military also had a vested interest in peasant morale. The People's Liberation Army fell the unpleasant task of suppressing peasant unrest. Moreover, soldiers were recruited in the countryside, and troop morale was adversely affected by disenchantment at home. The PLA conducted periodic surveys of troop morale and monitored letters from home. When the surveys and monitoring revealed disenchantment at home, the military command apparently voiced its concerns. As a result of these channels of communication, some military officers became particularly sensitive to the problems of the peasants and upon occasion acted as their representative. The Red Guards did not aid the peasants' morale, however. To many people, the artifacts and traditions that the Red Guard threatened were quite important. The Chinese armed forces knew this, and this reaction against the revolutionary forces was what spurred the armed forces' action against the Red Guards. The People's Liberation Army forced the Red Guards to cease their marches and return home in early February 1967. This was just as the spring planting was happening. Exactly as the Chinese peasantry needed order and stability, the Red Guards were stopped, as the PLA knew that agriculture would not be as affected with revolutionary school children running about. When the PLA fully ended the Red Guards, it was because of the reactions of these peasants and people around China.
To summarize, the Red Guards did much more than just destroying the old cultural artifacts. They completely reformed Chinese traditions and revolutionized China's culture, and ultimately ignited a strong, powerful reaction from the public. The Red Guards first forcefully reformed Chinese traditions. By punishing the old monks and tearing and erasing the sacred temples, the Red Guards tried to take centuries of Buddhist history and make it into a new sector. At the same time, they revolutionized cultural life. The government took total control over art, music, and theater by westernizing them fundamentally, shifting these traditional arts. In fact, people were only allowed to watch a handful of government-approved model operas, such as The White-Haired Girl and Taking Tiger Mountain by Stratton. But this aggressive control sparked massive reaction. The citizens of China, especially in rural areas, were deeply disturbed by the destruction of their old heritage. Slowly, resistance to the chaos grew so much stronger and more intense that the People's Liberation Army had to step in to suppress the Red Guards. In the end, the extreme push to reform and revolutionize Chinese culture pushed society to its breaking point. It was this undeniable public reaction that finally forced a limit on the Red Guards.
Have your views on that time period changed from then to now?
那当然有改变，对，因为文化大革命就是像那个中国政府最后给那个定性一样，就是一场人类的浩劫，是中国的经济、文化、道德所有的方面都是一个极大的倒退。